Volume 1, Chapter 1 of The Female American, or The Adventures of Unca Eliza Winkfield. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 1. Motives for writing this history. Discovery of Virginia. The author's grandfather settles there. He is killed by the natives. His son is taken prisoner, but is saved by one of the king's daughters. The following history of my life I never completely related but to one person, and at that time had no intention of committing it to writing. But finding the remembrance of it burdensome to my memory, I thought I might, in some degree, exonerate myself by digesting the most material events in the form of a history, for which purpose I collected together such loose memorandums as I had occasionally made, which have enabled me to render the following relation more regular and complete than otherwise it could have been, had I been obliged to trust only to the power of recollection. How and why I afterwards came otherwise to dispose of it will appear in due time. The lives of women being commonly domestic, the occurrences of them are generally pretty nearly of the same kind, whilst those of men, frequently more vagrant, subject them often to experience greater vicissitudes, many times wonderful and strange. Though a woman, it has been my lot to have experienced much of the latter, for so wonderful, strange, and uncommon have been the events of my life, that true history, perhaps, never recorded any that were more so. However, I shall not endeavor to extort the reader's credence of them, if such my work should ever have any, by solemn professions of veracity, for perhaps they may never be read, but if they should, I think the greatest skeptic will allow, uncommon as they are, that they do not exceed the bounds of probability. Here are two ends they cannot fail of answering: rational entertainment and mental improvement. To proceed, then, the peaceful reign of King James I of England gave opportunity to the first attempt of the English to make a settlement in the Indies, at a place called, originally, Wingondacoa, part of the continent adjoining to Florida, called afterwards Virginia, in honor of our maiden Queen Elizabeth, of blessed memory. As this place was first discovered by the great Sir Walter Raleigh, he obtained letters patent to settle a plantation there, Anno Dam 1584. But it was some years after that time before any colony was sent there. The first plantation that proved successful began in 1607. At this time a colony arrived there of about 100 persons, among the conductors of whom was Mr. Edward Maria Winkfield, my grandfather. But as many of these died, a further supply was sent the year after, under the care of Captain Nielsen, and again more in 1610, 1611, 1612. In 1618, the settlement was thought of consequence enough to receive a governor from England. A very large colony arrived there 2 years after, and now the newcomers formed themselves into corporations. The first and principal town was honored with the name of King James, but the happy prospect with which the newcomers flattered themselves was unhappily obscured by the native Indians, who came unexpectedly upon them and massacred 300 of them. But this loss was soon repaired by a fresh recruit from England. Thus much for the first peopling my native country. The plantation which my grandfather first began, and which was the largest and most successful, devolved in a flourishing state to my father, Mr. William Winkfield, of whom I must relate a very extraordinary adventure, as it gave occasion to his growing more suddenly rich than he could have done by an infant plantation, and gave birth to me, and in the consequences of it effected a more happy issue to my future adventures than could otherwise have happened. At the time of the massacre mentioned above, my grandfather was killed, and my father, with a few more, was taken prisoners by the Indians, and as it was a very dark night, was hurried along many miles before he could perfectly discover any objects. At length the rising sun discovered to his view, at some distance, a large river with a great number of boats on it. Into one of these he was forced, and then bound hand and foot. In a little time all the boats were in motion, and for some hours continued to go with great rapidity. My father had now but too much time to reflect on his unpromising situation, and recalling to his mind the words of his elder brother, whom he had left in England, he thought them unhappily predictive. He was a clergyman, and one of true piety and sound erudition. When his brother, my father, was about to quit England with their father to settle in this new discovered country, "My dear brother Bill," said he, "I know too well my duty to my father to remonstrate against any action of his, though in secret I may dread the consequence. But as I am your brother and your elder, I may presume to give my opinion, may it not be prophetic. We have no right to invade the country of another, and I fear invaders will always meet a curse. But as your youth disenables you from viewing this expedition in that equitable light that it ought to be looked on, may your sufferings be proportionately light, for our God is just and will weigh our actions in a just scale." My father at this time was about 20 years old, of a remarkable fair complexion for a man, with brown hair, black eyes, and was well shaped. I should not give a description of his person, but that to it he owed, as it seems, his future preservation. The Indians continued their voyage about 4 or 5 hours, when they stopped on the same side of the shore on which they had embarked. As soon as they were landed, my father, with 5 other English captives, tied one to another, were drove, like sheep, many miles up the country, and then lodged in a cabin till next day. However, in the interim, they were plentifully supplied with dried Indian corn, dried goat's flesh, and a kind of small wine, but thick, though well flavored. They had heard that some of the Indians were men-eaters, and thought these were such, but that they would not have fed them so plentifully, but to render them, as we do hogs, the better food. However, in this they were mistaken. The next day, soon after sunrising, my father and his 5 unhappy companions were brought out of their cabin, their clothes were taken off, and they placed in a circle formed by a great number of Indians of both sexes, all naked, except a small covering of foliage about their middle, which decently covered the distinction of sexes. This local covering of several of the females was composed of beautiful flowers. The unhappy captives stood amidst this assembly a considerable time, whilst a venerable old man seemed to address them in a pathetic manner, for tears accompanied his words. He was, as my father afterwards learned, their king, and of a very numerous people, and the purport of his long speech was this: "Men, for I see you have legs, arms, and heads as we have, look to the sun." Here he pointed up to that luminary. "He is our God. Is he yours? He made us. He warms us. He lights us. He makes our corn and grass to grow. We love and praise him. Did he make you? Did he send you to punish us? If he did, we will die. Here are our bows and arrows. Kill us." Saying this, they all threw their bows and arrows within the circle between themselves and the captives. Not then knowing their meaning, they stood silent. The king then continued his speech. "Our God is not angry. The evil being who made you has sent you into our land to kill us. We know you not, and have never offended you. Why then have you taken possession of our lands, ate our fruits, and made our countrymen prisoners? Had you no lands of your own? Why did you not ask? We would have given you some. Speak." It seems they had no idea that there are more languages than one. Therefore, taking their silence for a confession of guilt, their king proceeded. "You designed to kill us, but we hurt no man who has not first offended us. Our God has given you into our hands, and you must die." This said, the Indians took up their bows and arrows, whilst others bound my father and his 5 unhappy countrymen, and cut off the heads of the latter, one after another. My father expected the same fate, But just as the executioner was about to give the stroke, a maiden, who stood by the king, and whose neck, breast, and arms were curiously adorned with jewels, diamonds, and solid pieces of gold and silver, and who was one of the king's daughters, stroked my father with a wand. This was the signal for deliverance. He was immediately unbound, and a covering, like that the Indians wore, was put round his body, and a kind of chain, formed of long grass, round his neck, of a considerable length, one end of which the princess took hold of, and gently led him along, till she came to a bower composed of the most pleasing greens, delightfully variegated with the most beautiful flowers, a shady defence from the sun, which then shone with uncommon heat. Beneath was a large collection of leaves, which covered the whole surface of the ground to a great depth. Here she made him sit, none present but themselves. She seated herself by him, viewed him with great attention from head to foot, felt his face and hands, but with the greatest modesty. She then arose, and going out, returned presently with a cocoa-nut shell, and drinking first, presented him the remainder of a liquor of most delicious taste, of the vinous kind, at the same time offering him a basket of various fruits. My father freely accepted of both, and found himself surprisingly refreshed. She then made a sign to him to lie down, and with looks of ineffable tenderness retired, having first laid her bow and quiver filled with arrows by him, and fastened the door of the bower with a twig. This tender and extraordinary treatment had so far composed my father's mind that, joined with the excessive heat of the day and the wine together, he was so much overcome that he insensibly fell asleep amidst his reflections on this strange adventure. When he awoke, he found 2 Indian slaves fanning and defending him from the flies, which in that country are very hurtful. No sooner did they perceive he was awake, but one of his attendants withdrew, and presently returned, I cannot say with his fare, but with his black deliverer, who, smiling, gently pulled him by his chain, and led him, now willing and fearless, to a neighboring cabin, greatly distinguished from those about it, both by its largeness and elegance. Here he again saw the king, before whom he bowed, whilst his patroness presented the end of the chain she held to her father, who, with much seeming affability, returned it to his daughter. By this act my father understood he gave him as a captive to his daughter, who, immediately breaking the chain from around his neck, threw it at his feet, making a motion to him that he should set his foot upon it, which he having done, she clapped her hands and cried out, "Hala Pana Chi Nu, great peace be to you." Though my father did not then understand her words, he could not but conceive her actions as declarative of his liberty, for actions are a kind of universal language. He therefore threw himself at her feet, when she in return offered him her hand to rise, and then led him into another cabin, completely furnished after the Indian manner. Here he found the 2 Indian slaves who had attended him in the bower. These the princess presented to him, and whom by the homage they paid him, he understood he was to consider as his slaves. His clothes, which had been taken from him, together with those of his less happy companions, were brought to him. The princess continued some hours with him, and they participated of a collection of fruits, whilst the princess continually talked to him, as if he understood her language. This agreeable society continued several weeks, she visiting him every day, showing him the neighboring fountains, woods, and walks, and everything that could amuse. At last my father had began to understand her language, which redoubled all her past pleasures, when, according to the simplicity of the uncorrupted Indians, she declared that love for him, which he had long before understood by her actions. Though a complexion so different as that of the princess from a European cannot but at first disgust, yet by degrees my father grew insensible to the difference, and in other respects her person was not inferior to that of the greatest European beauty. But what was more, her understanding was uncommonly great, pleasantly lively, and wonderfully comprehensive, even of subjects unknown to her, till informed of them by my father, who took extraordinary pains to instruct her. For now he loved in his turn, and sure he must have had a heart strangely insensible, if such great kindness, joined with such perfections, had not had that effect. They had now lived together 6 months, and understood each other tolerably, when Unca, for that was the princess's name, proposed their marriage. As she was a pagan, though my father sincerely loved her and wished for that union, he could not help showing some uneasiness at the proposal. This the observant princess instantly saw. "What," cried she, "does not my Unca," so as she called him, "love me?" My father caught her in his arms. "Yes, my dear Unca," cried he, "I do, but my God will be angry if I marry you, unless you will worship him as I do." This gave birth to a long conversation, in which, though my father was a very sensible man, and had enjoyed a good education, being very young, he found it not a little difficult to teach another what he firmly believed himself. But as we readily believe those whom we love, he was more successful than he expected, and in a little time the princess became convinced of her errors, and her good understanding helped to forward her conversion. Thus love and religion agreeably divided their time, and so happy was my father with his princess that he almost forgot his former situation, and begun to look upon the country he was in as his own. Nor indeed did he ever expect to see any other again, and he now loved Unca as much as she did him, and was therefore willing to make her and her country his forever. But an unexpected event soon gave a different turn to their affairs. End of chapter 1.